Hello class, in this video I'm going to introduce the inverse cosine function. Let's begin. Okay, just like I did with the inverse sine function, I'm going to use the graph of the cosine function to graph the inverse cosine function. So what I've done is I've already plotted and graphed cosine of x. And if you remember, a function has to be one-to-one in order for a function to have an inverse. And right now, cosine over its current domain does not have an inverse. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to restrict the domain of this function so that it does have an inverse. So just like I did with the sine function, I'm going to start at the origin, and I'm going to travel to the right. So the function decreases until pi, and then it starts to increase. If I were to place a horizontal line right here, that horizontal line represents a range value, and if I travel further than pi, cosine will no longer be one-to-one because the range value will have two domain values. So I'm going to place a vertical line at pi, and I'm going to ignore this part of the graph right here. Going back to the origin, notice that the origin starts by decreasing. And if I were to place a horizontal line, like such, if I were to travel to the left of 0, cosine is no longer a one-to-one function because that range value has two different domain values. So I'm going to place a dotted vertical line right here, and I'm going to ignore that part of the graph. So now, if I were to place a horizontal line along a certain range value, notice that each range value now has only one domain value. So if cosine is between 0 and pi, cosine will be one-to-one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a table of values for cosine, inverse cosine, and then graph the inverse cosine function. So to the left is your table of values for the cosine function, and notice that these angles are between 0 and pi. The angles right here are in quadrant 1, and the angles right here are in quadrant 2. With the cosine function, you input angles and you output ratios. For the inverse function, which we will label not arc sine, but we will label arc cosine. So let me just cross that out real quick. We can also label it the inverse cosine. So to find the coordinates for the inverse cosine, we're going to reverse the coordinates in the table on the left. So the first one being 1, 0, and I'm going to reverse all of the coordinates now. So for the inverse cosine, The inputs are the ratios, and the outputs are the angles. And notice that the angles, again, are in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. And now we're ready to graph the inverse cosine function. And I'm going to do that by plotting 1, 0, 0 pi halves, and negative 1 pi. Okay, so we're going to plot 1, 0. So 1, 0 is right here. The next is 0 pi halves, right there. And then negative 1 pi, right here. And that is the graph of the inverse cosine function.